When they told me I had 30 days to hand over $100,000 or lose the dirt my great-grandfather died for, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even flinch. I just looked that woman dead in her reflected sunglasses and asked if she'd remembered to bring enough body bags, because out here in the high desert of Montana, we don't negotiate with paper-pushing terrorists who think a clip-on tie gives them the right to redraw the map. You see, my name is Silas Vance, and the land I'm standing on isn't just a GPS coordinate. It's a living, breathing history of every drop of sweat my family ever spilled, 160 acres of limestone ridges, rusted cattle guards, and ponderosa pines that have stood witness to a century of survival. My great-granddad, Silas the Elder, bought this place in 1914 with nothing but a gold tooth and a heavy-duty stubborn streak, and he spent his life digging wells that didn't want to be dug and burying the kind of men who thought trespassing was a suggestion. So, when I inherited the Vance homestead, it wasn't a gift, it was more like a dare from the grave. The first few months back were quiet, just the way I liked it, working from dawn until my joints sang a chorus of complaints, mending fences that the winter had chewed through, and listening to the coyotes gossip at dusk. But that peace shattered the morning a sleek, pearl-white Range Rover crawled up my gravel drive like a tick looking for a place to latch on. I was out back by the old smithy, covered in grease and frustration with a seized tractor engine, when I saw 3 people step out of that air-conditioned bubble looking like they'd just been peeled off the cover of a suburban lifestyle magazine. The woman in the lead had a haircut that cost more than my first truck and a smile that felt like a surgical incision, sharp and bloodless. And behind her were 2 men who looked like they'd been hired for their ability to look bored while holding clipboards. And I knew right then, my granddad's warnings about the, creeping, rotten, of a nearby development wearing and oppos. Just the ramblings of an old man. Because on the side of that SUV was a logo that read, Highlands Ridge Estates and Amp. Preservation Authority. The woman didn't oppose to even wait for me to wipe the oil off my hands before she started talking about, visual aesthetics, and community cohesion, her voice sounding like a violin string pulled too tight, telling me her name was Beatrice Thorne, and that as the president of the Highlands Ridge HOA, she was here to rectify a, historic oversight, She opened a leather-bound folder and started reciting a list of violations that sounded like a bad comedy routine. Unapproved agricultural equipment, non-compliant perimeter fencing, and the existence of a, dilapidated structure, which happened to be the barn my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. And then she hit me with the kicker. A bill for $102,000 in retroactive dues, interest, and, rehabilitation fees, I just stood there, leaning against the rusted fender of my John Deere, letting a slow breath out and watching a hawk circle overhead, wondering if these people honestly thought they could just walk onto a century-old ranch and declare themselves the landlords because they'd built a gated community 2 miles down the road. And when I told them they were about 3 miles outside their jurisdiction and 6 inches away from a trespassing charge, the big guy in the back, a former deputy named Miller who traded his badge for an HOA windbreaker, stepped forward and told me not to make this difficult. Beatrice didn't oppose. Flinch. She just slid a paper toward me that claimed my property had been, integrated, into their buffer zone via a 2021 county rezoning ordinance that I'd supposedly never contested. And she looked at me with this pitying expression, the kind you give a dog that doesn't oppose. Realized it oppose. That's about to be put down, and said that the board had already voted and the lien was being prepared as we spoke. I didn't oppose. Sign her paper, I didn't oppose. Give her the satisfaction of seeing me angry. I just walked into the house, grabbed the double barrel that had lived over the mantel since the Great Depression, and walked back out without saying a single word. I didn't oppose. Pointed at them. I just held it low, checking the chambers with a rhythmic click-clack that seems to speak a universal language, and the silence that followed was so heavy you could have weighed it on a scale. Beatrice's smile didn't oppose. Break, but her eyes went cold, and she whispered that I would regret choosing a, violent path, before they backed into their SUV and retreated down the drive, leaving a cloud of dust that felt like a declaration of war. And that was the moment I realized the war for my home was and oppose. It going to be fought with lead. It was going to be fought with ink signatures and the kind of bureaucratic cruelty that happens in air-conditioned rooms while you and Oppos busy working the land. The very next morning, the paper bullets started flying, and they hit harder than I expected. I went into town to pick up some cedar posts, and my debit card was declined to the register. And when I called the bank, a nervous-sounding teller told me my accounts had been, provisionally restricted, due to an emergency civil judgment filed by the Highlands Ridge Authority. I felt a cold knot of fury tie itself in my stomach, because they hadn't and Oppos just come from my land. They'd come from my lifeblood, cutting off my ability to even buy a gallon of milk or fuel for my truck. I spent the next 4 hours at the county courthouse, digging through records until my eyes blurred, and that's where I met a clerk named Martha, a woman who looked like she'd been part of the furniture since the 70s and who remembered my grandfather. She leaned over the counter and whispered that I wasn't an Oppos. The first person Beatrice Thorne had targeted, that there was transition zone map being passed around in closed-door meetings that showed my ranch being carved up into half-acre custom estates and a boutique winery, and she slid me a copy of the annexation filing, pointing out a signature at the bottom that made my heart stop. It was my grandfather's name, Earl Vance, dated just 3 months before he passed away, agreeing to a, voluntary easement and jurisdictional transfer, in exchange for a lifetime maintenance waiver. But here's the thing, my grandfather couldn't in Oppos to even hold a pen in his final year. His hands were so ravaged by Parkinson and Oppos, as he couldn't in Oppos to even button his own shirt, let alone sign a legal document with a flourish like that. I knew right then I wasn't Oppos just dealing with a greedy HOA. I was dealing with a criminal syndicate in golf shirts, and I realized that if I played by their rules, I'd be homeless by Christmas. So I decided it was time to stop being a rancher and start being a ghost. I reached out to an old contact from my time in the service, a guy named Elias who specialized in the kind of digital forensics that makes people in power sweat, and I told him I needed to see the, backstage, of the Highlands Ridge financial engine. And while he started digging, I started setting a trap of my own. A few days later, a man named Caleb showed up on my fence, looking like a drifter, but smelling like a law office, offering to help me, mediate, the situation for a small fee, claiming he was a neutral third party who just hated to see a local man lose his heritage. But I saw the way his eyes kept darting toward my barn and the old well house, and I remembered what my granddad said about the devil not wearing horns, but a helpful grin. I played along, acting like a broken man, letting him into the house and showing him, files, that I'd carefully planted, fake surveys and modified deeds that suggested there were massive, undisclosed environmental liabilities on the property, specifically a, forgotten, chemical dump from the 40s, and as I watched him secretly take photos of those documents with his phone, I knew the bait had been taken. You see, the HOA didn't end Oppos. Just want my land for the view. They wanted it for a massive development loan they were securing, and the one thing that kills a development loan faster than a fire is the word, toxic waste, While the HOA was busy panicking over my fake environmental disaster, Elias hit pay dirt on their actual books, finding a trail of, consulting fees, that Beatrice Thorne had been paying to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, a company that just happened to be owned by the very county commissioner who had approved the rezoning of my ranch. It was a classic, pay-to-play, scheme, a circle of corruption that had been strangling our county for years, and my ranch was supposed to be the crown jewel in their final heist. But they'd made the mistake of thinking I was just a simple man with a shotgun and a grievance. I didn't in Oppos to go to the police, not yet, because the sheriff was Miller's brother-in-law. Instead, I used the one thing an HOA fears more than a lawsuit, the neighbors they've been bullying for years. I started holding, secret, meetings in my barn at midnight, inviting the people whose trees had been, illegally, trimmed and whose kids had been banned from playing in their own driveways, showing them the evidence of where their monthly dues were actually going. And the look on their faces wasn't Oppos. Just anger. It was a collective awakening of people who had been told they were powerless for too long. The tension reached a boiling point on the night of the annual, Highlands Ridge Community Gala, A black tie affair held at the clubhouse where Beatrice was expected to announce the, end quote, expansion, end quote, of the development onto the Vance homestead. I didn't oppose. T show up in a suit. I showed up in my work boots and a grease-stained jacket, carrying a manila folder and a USB drive that contained the funeral of her career. The security guards tried to block me, but they weren't into oppos. T expecting 60 angry homeowners to be standing right behind me, filming everything on their phones and demanding to be let in. I walked right up onto that stage, interrupting Beatrice mid-sentence while she was talking about, end quote, progress, end quote, and I didn't oppose. TL, I didn't oppose. T point a gun, I just plugged that drive into the projector and showed the room the side-by-side comparison of my grandfather's actual signature versus the forged one on their annexation document. The room went so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the cocktail glasses as I scrolled through the bank transfers to the commissioner and the, end quote, environmental report, end quote. Caleb had stolen from my house, which I then revealed was a total fabrication designed to catch a thief. And then I looked Beatrice in the eye and told her she had 5 minutes to resign before the FBI, who were already sitting in the back row thanks to Elias's tip, took her out in front of everyone. The fallout was spectacular. Beatrice was let out in handcuffs along with Miller and the commissioner. The HOA board was dissolved by a unanimous vote of the residents the following week, and the, end quote, Highlands Ridge Estates, end quote, is now just a group of neighbors who actually talk to each other instead of measuring each other in oppos. As grass height. I went back to my ranch, back to the quiet and the rusted tractors, and I spent a week just sitting on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the ridges and feeling the weight of a century of history finally resting easy on my shoulders. I'd save the land, not with a shotgun, but with the very thing they tried to use against me, the truth. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, the question I want to ask you. If someone came to your door today with a piece of paper and a smile, claiming they own the dirt under your feet, how far would you go to protect it? Is a house just a structure, or is it a part of your soul that's worth fighting a war for? Even if that war is fought in the shadows of courtroom? Drop a comment below and tell me if you think I went too far, or if you'd have done the exact same thing to keep the vultures off your fence line. And don't forget to subscribe, because out here, the stories are just as wild as the wind, and I'm just getting started.